Hello, everyone. I'm Claudio Murgan, the host of the Spiritually Inspired podcast, and my guest today is Kat Armas. Kat is a Cuban American writer and podcaster from Miami, Florida. She holds a dual Master in Divinity and Masters of Arts and Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, where she was awarded the Frederick Buechner Award for Excellence in Writing, and is currently pursuing a Theology Master at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Her first book, Abuelita Faith: What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength, sits at the intersection of women, decolonialism, the Bible, and Cuban identity. She also explores these topics and more on her podcast, The Protagonistas, which centers the voices of Black, Indigenous, and other women of color in theological spaces. Kat, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Um, I read that you are, of course, of Cuban descent, second generation in US, and I'm halfway through your book, so I don't know if you had the chance to visit the island.
Yeah, so actually that's I do talk about that in a chapter of my book and how I was planning to. So my family after they left, they have very strong feelings about returning. They're just like not very supportive of returning. So I was actually planning a trip, and the night before the morning I was supposed to leave, my grandfather, or I write about him, Mario, he's my grandmother's second husband. He passed away that night, and it was like the most bizarre thing because I hadn't told my grandmother that I was going because I knew how she'd feel about it, so I didn't tell her. I was just going to be like, yeah, I'm going on a trip, and that night, he died, and it was kind of unexpected. We knew he was passing, but we didn't think it would be that night. And I write about that in my book, so you'll get there to that section. But yeah, that was a big like moment for me because I realized, like, maybe, and I was planning on going on like a quote unquote mission trip. And so for me, it was more so, maybe I just needed to be here. And I write, sometimes being a disciple of Jesus requires being and not necessarily doing. And I think in that moment, I was like, I just need to be and not go and do. And so, yeah, that was sort of my a little background as to when I was going to go and why I didn't.
Yes, and you mentioned that you're stuffing Bibles in your bags,
Yeah,
hoping that you're going to be able to uh,
right.
sneak them into the Cuban territory. But what was the deeper purpose of going to Cuba and handing out the Bibles?
Yeah, so the church that I was a part of, excuse me, an evangelical church, and they were all about, planting different churches and in different, cities and different countries and different places. And part of a big part of the evangelical movement is to, evangelize, right? To share the gospel, to go to different places and tell people about Jesus. And when I was, in the evangelical world, I was fully into that. I was fully involved with that message or uh that sort of calling. And so I was going to go and, meet with pastors. And granted, I don't know how much evangelizing we were going to do, but we were going to go and, just connect with local pastors and try and see if we could plant a church there. Now, my theological ideas have changed since then, as far as mission trips and as far as, evangelizing. The way that I see those things or that I engage with those things is very differently now. But yeah, I mean, back then that was I wanted to go and be a missionary, in Cuba for a few weeks. And yeah, and I am happy the way that it, or I guess not happy is the right word, but I am pleased in the way the outcome that turned out. I think that I needed to kind of step back, as I write in the book. I needed to not show up as someone thinking that I was spiritually or theologically superior to any people, even my people, even though I, haven't lived half of the struggles that my people had. So what could I possibly have, to bring to them other than what Bibles, like if they don't have any. And so I think that that was a big um, theological shifting point for me as I, processed that time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wanted to go a little bit deeper into this type of mindset of a missionary. And we all know throughout history that what happened with missionaries when they went to, South America and Africa
Right.
in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, and they tried to change the mindset of the
Right.
locals, of the indigenous, which had their own way of living, their own
Right.
mindset for millennia, and they had their shamans and the doctors and their wise people, and suddenly
Yeah.
a stranger comes in and they want to change their way of
Right.
living. And again, it
Yeah.
was brutal at that time. In the 20th century, it wasn't, the mindset was totally different. But do you see normal that we should go in and change old traditions based on our own values, knowing that it will disturb that tribe's life, that society's life, based on our own values and not on their values, and we don't try to understand their values. And
Right.
if we cannot come to a conclusion, just go, leave, let them be.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I don't think, that's something that we should be doing, which is why I said, my mindset's changed a lot since then, Um, and I write a little bit about this in Abuelita Faith of just the history of colonization and how, this is a tale as old as time. I mean, white Europeans have gone into all sorts of countries, Latin American, African, Asian countries, and brought their European way of being, saying that this is the way to be, the only way you must be, right? Um, and it has caused, havoc across the world, right? And even now, I know that, it's a little different now. We're not necessarily going in there and like slaughtering people and taking them as slaves, but I think the mindset is actually very similar, right? It's, white superiority, right? The whiteness, white way of being is better, wiser. We have quote unquote these technological advances. Although you look at so many indigenous peoples, and I mean their sort of technologies were so advanced, for their time. I mean, you look at like the Mayans and you look at all of these civilizations that yeah, they had so much wisdom. And I think that that's what I'm trying to speak to in Abuelita Faith is the notion of wisdom. I talk about how so many of our marginalized grandmothers, our abuelitas, so many of the people that are overlooked, that whiteness overlooks, are wise. They hold a wisdom within their bodies. They hold a wisdom within their traditions. They hold a wisdom that we've been told is not wisdom, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get at. And also, the notion of like who gets to say what wisdom is, right? Like who gets to say who is wise? And I think that that is something that I'm wrestling with in Abuelita Faith. We've been told that other ways of being, other ways of knowing, other forms of spirituality is against God or whatever. But who gets to say that? Who gets to decide that, And we've let, certain people decide that. And then we've just kind of believed it and gone along with it. And I think that that's why we've gotten to this place where I was swaddling Bibles to take to Cuba to like tell the Cubans about Jesus, like if, they had never heard of Jesus and they needed me, a privileged in their eyes, a privileged American, Cuban American, that has no connection to their lived experience to come and like tell them about Jesus. So yeah, I think it's modern, colonialism, it's modern colonization, really our mission efforts.
Yeah, and nice, interesting part of your book, which trigger emotions and memories in me, was you talking about your abuelita preparing dinner, and to me that
Yes.
experience turned into knowledge because while she's
Mhm.
preparing dinner, she can share some of her nuggets of knowledge with you, and
Right.
that knowledge is she doesn't have to go to, as you mentioned, a cookbook to look at the ingredients, to look at how much grams of this and that should be put into the dish. And again, I'm looking at my kids who started to cook recently, and they always go to a cookbook. And I tell them just
Okay.
look
Follow the
by the
wisdom
eye,
of your
or
body.
yeah, smell a little bit and you know how much, or taste a little bit and you know how much to put. No, 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 I have to go by the cookbook. So that
Hmm.
still talks to experience turned into knowledge, which
Right.
can be passed through generations. And if one generation is missed, maybe the whole chain is broken, and you would
Right.
have to start reinventing the wheel, if I can say so.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And I think, going back to this notion of wisdom, I mean, that is a wisdom that lives within us, right? The wisdom of your ancestors, the wisdom of your traditions, the wisdom of your own body, right? To trust that, like you said, taste it and see, like just smell it and see. I think that that is a form of bodily wisdom. But yeah, but in our modern world and Western society, we're not taught to trust the wisdom of our bodies. We're not taught to trust the wisdom of our ancestors, the wisdom of our traditions. We're taught to trust the wisdom that, comes from the quote unquote experts, right? Whether it's the cooking experts or whether it's the theology experts. I talk about an abuelita faith, how I was trained to think or to look to, the white men on the pulpits with the degrees to teach me about God, when all along my greatest teacher was my grandmother, my abuela, who had no theological education. She had no education. She grew up in, rural part of Cuba, but, she had a wisdom beyond what the academy can teach us. She had a wisdom beyond what we could learn in a classroom or at a pulpit, and it was that ancestral bodily traditional, if you will, wisdom, that comes from cooking meals without a cookbook, or making clothes, right? I talk about how she made clothes, and that's a form of wisdom. And I even argue that it's not just wisdom, it's theology. We are telling the story of God. We are thinking about the things of God as we sit around the table, as we make food, as we make clothes with our hands. Because if you look at the story of, obviously the Jewish and Christian story, I mean, that's how people told stories of, that's how they served, that's how they loved, that's how they yeah, survived really. And I think that that's something also that I'm really honing in on in Abuelita Faith, is this notion of survival. We over spiritualize the idea of survival. We over spiritualize so much in the Bible, but a lot of what people were trying to do was literally just eat and like live. And the women in the Bible were trying to get married so that they wouldn't be left widowed and destitute and die. Like it wasn't anything super spiritual. But in those stories of survival, God calls them blessed and righteous, and they end up in the genealogy of I mean, all of these things, just mere survival. And I think that that also is where we find and experience that wisdom that I'm talking about.
Yes, there those times people were in those times people were just trying to, as you said, survive, provide the basic requirements and needs for their families, and stay out of
Right,
trouble. I mean, a
right,
spiritual goal, I don't think it was attainable or even acknowledged by maybe 99% of
right.
those living in those times. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's just a matter of how we see these stories and perceive these stories, and extract certain truth or knowledge or teachings based on our
right.
own perception. So, yes.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely.
In your book, you mentioned that you studied the work of several women, such as Perpetua, Felicitas, Julian of Norwich, and Katharina Schutz-Zell. What did you learn that they have in common?
Yeah, so that's kind of what started a lot of my journey as a, particularly as a woman, it was studying. I took a women in church history class, and I had come from a context where, women weren't allowed to teach or weren't allowed to preach, or, we women had to be submissive to men. And so I come from this context, and then I leave to another context, and that's where I began studying a lot of European women in church history. And of course, we're studying it. The class is called Women in Church History, but it's only European women, right? And that's really where my journey began, of like just thinking about, well, what about Cuban women? What about Latin American women? But But anyways, what I learned from these incredible women, I mean, despite, where they're from, they still did incredible things. So many of them, still, despite not being quote unquote allowed, or despite not there not being a space or a place for them, they still, theologize. They still, many of them were martyrs. And not that I'm, saying that we all need to, like just live a martyrdom life, but it was this idea that they weren't willing to let anything stop them from what they believed in, what they felt called to, even to the point of death. And I think, yeah, I just realized that there were so many women that, these stories were untold. And, maybe some of us have heard of course, Julian of Norwich, and we've heard of some of these women, but I think they deserve way more than just like, a blip in the story. I mean, these women, so many of them were leaders in their communities. I mean, even someone like Julian of Norwich, people would come and line up at their windows, to receive healing and prayer. And, you had entire communities that saw these women as, yeah, as just as a leader type in that space. And so, yeah, I learned so much about, I would say the main thing is, and the main feeling I felt learning about these women was, why didn't I know about them sooner? I had already been through 2 years of seminary, and I had only learned about, the things that men did, right? Um, and that's when like I said, I became curious about all of the women in Latin America, all of the women in Cuba, all of the women that are, their stories are even, even more hidden and untold than the ones of Felicitas and Julian of Norwich and Perpetua, who were just incredible leaders. I mean, they again, they believed to the point, they believed in their calling, they believed in um their faith, and they were willing to do anything to that end.
Yes, it's interesting that the history wants to bury these women leaders because it's not part of the narrative, and
Right.
upsets certain institution or certain
Yeah.
line of thinking. That's
Oh
not
yeah.
nice. During my reading and research, there's a lot of information about indigenous cultures and shamanism and traditional way of healing. And it's very common in South America, Peru, Brazil, Chile, but not. I didn't hear that much from Cuba. Did you encounter any such traditions in Cuba? Were they suppressed in purpose?
Yeah, so actually one of the big traditions, I guess you can say more traditional spirituality or expressions of spirituality is Santeria. And that was brought over from the enslaved, people of Africa, those who were brought over. Of course, Cuba is on the Caribbean, and so that was a just a hot spot for the slave trade and just bringing over yeah, folks from Africa. And so that, I mean, Santeria was brought over very early on, and obviously around the same time. So was Catholicism from Spanish colonization, and so even today you have it's very popular for the majority of people to sort of adhere to or follow a blend of popular Catholicism, and Santeria. It's very common for you to, see the Santeros or the saints, alongside the Orisha saints, and so I think that is, yeah, I found it very interesting. And even though my grandmother, she, was more so along like the Catholic sort of tradition, you really can't fully separate the two. You really can't fully. There were so many things about her form of popular, and I say popular Catholicism, meaning that she lived far from a place where there was a church, and so she wasn't able to attend mass regularly. But she was still faithful in her faith, and faithful in her Catholic traditions, and she still had the saints, and she still practice all of the things that you would normally practice without having access to mass. But even in that, I mean, there's so many ways that you see those two traditions blended. The Virgin Mary, even you see that there's a form of Mary in the Santeria tradition, and it's kind of, it's very interesting. And as I was doing my research, I realized, like, wow, there was a lot of things that that my family sort of held to or believed that came from, or was brought over and just sort of was blended into Santeria. So anyway, even now in Miami, there are people, or there are families who are full Santeros. And so they're like fully, embrace Santeria. And I mean, it's very common. Every house that I've lived in Miami, it's just been surrounded by santeros, and by their rituals, and by the way that they still do animal sacrifices, and you can hear it, and so it's still a very big part of Cuban culture.
Yes, I mean, from what I heard, is a very tight community, so close
Hmm.
to the island, but at the same
Right,
time, so far away.
right. Yep.
And if I may come back to my first question, did you have the chance to visit the island or not?
Oh, no, no. Yeah, that was the story that I shared, that I was going to, and then I
Hmm.
never,
Sure.
yeah, I wasn't able to. Yeah.
Okay. In your book, you asked the question, is this the Jesus who saved me? And I would like to know, what's your meaning of being saved?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think my definition has shifted and changed, and just depending on, where I am theologically, of course. Um, and to be honest, I can't fully understand that question. I think a lot of it is a spiritual phenomenon. I think a lot of it is, back then I would say, and what I experienced a spiritual experience back then, which was interesting to me because I was raised Catholic, which, I always believed in Jesus. I always believed, in God. And, I always thought that Jesus was God. That was always sort of obviously in man form, but, that was always part of my belief system. And then, when I was introduced to evangelicalism, like it was I was told that no, I had to pray a certain prayer and believe certain truths. And that's really what even led to writing of this book, that I believed, and I was told that my grandmother's faith, because it wasn't evangelical, because it was, expressed differently, it wasn't legitimate. And so I thought, that my entire community, I thought that I wasn't quote unquote saved because I believed in, I don't know, the sacraments. Like it's just so blurry, really. If you really think about it, the lines, like there's no really clear reason why, anyone other than evangelicals are, saved. And yeah, and that was for me, I thought that in that moment, oh, now I'm saved because I believe the quote unquote the right things I need to believe. And so a lot of my journey has been deconstructing that idea, and a lot of my journey has been sort of untangling and unweaving that idea and realizing, wait a minute, no, I knew Jesus from when I was a young kid. And so I think, the whole notion of being saved, even that I think comes from a very colonial mindset, like, you are lost, you are depraved, you are, whatever. And then all of a sudden, here comes the white Europeans, or here comes this white God, this European white God to save you from your, carnal, whatever. So even that idea, I reject that now, of course. But I did have, and I can never deny that experience that I had. I did experience something. And so that's, when I talk about being saved in that sense, that's the moment that I was referring to. But a lot of my journey in Abuelita faith is really just deconstructing that and saying, wait a minute, but I knew God, I knew God before then. And I think that that's true for a lot of people, right? I think a lot of folks um, know God in one way or another, in whether it's through their traditions, through their, their ancestral traditions, through their own bodies, right? People know and experience God in different ways. And so when I use that word in the book, I was referring to like the evangelical saved that told me now I'm saved. But yeah, that that way of thinking has changed, of course. I think that many of us, yeah, we know God or the divine, we know in different ways, and God makes God self-known. I think to think that God can only appear in one way, in one particular belief system, is to limit God's, to make God into this puny little thing, So yeah.
Exactly. Each of us has his own experience of God, of divinity. And if we just look at facts, I mean, Jesus was Middle Eastern. He just couldn't have been white,
Right.
not. And then we know another fact is history books were changed in our lifetime. At least in
Oh
my
yeah.
lifetime, in my country of origin, the history books were changed multiple times in the
Oh
last
yeah.
20 years. So to believe that the Bible hasn't changed in 1600 years because it wasn't written in year zero, it was written, started like 300, 400 years later, um, also would be silly not to
Right.
believe that it was changed based on some interests.
Oh yeah.
And I recently read an interpretation or the version, the
Mhm.
translated version from the Hebrew language. And you also mentioned that in your book, certain words which were translated wrongly.
Right.
And it gave me pause. I mean, after reading that version, it turns the Old Testament into a history book and nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the
Mm-hmm.
God they talk in the Old Testament just cannot be the creator, cannot be the loving God which we all
Hmm.
know. Because
Right.
the God in the Old Testament talks about killing and extermination and
Right.
extermination of whole tribes.
Right.
So if in our hearts we consider the God, loving, caring because he created us, then how can he ask us to commit cruel sacrifice?
Genocide.
You
Yeah.
know? So I
Yeah.
asked myself for years, how could such act of violence please the God,
Right.
unless the God in the Bible at least, unless the God
Right.
is not the same one with the creator? What's your take on that?
Yeah. So, I feel like that's like the question, right? For so many people that study the Bible and that study, the question of theodicy. And so I, you know, the way that I understand it, because I've studied the Bible for, I have two masters in the Bible and I'm getting a third, and that's all to say that there's still so much that I literally I have no idea. But I agree with you. I mean, it is a lot of it is just historical. A lot of it is just the way that I understand it is a group of people, right? The Jewish people trying to make sense of who they are, right? I mean, period. They're just trying to make sense of what they believe, who they are, their own history, their marginalization, their oppression, their yeah, just trying to make sense of who they are. And I think we all have that. We're all whether collectively or individually trying to make sense of yeah, who we are and where we come from, what we believe. And so I think that that's also true when you think of the Hebrew scriptures or you think of the old, quote unquote, the Old Testament. I've read things that say when you read of a God that is asking folks to commit genocide, that is asking folks to essentially oppress the God literally is, in the Bible, it's written that God says, do not oppress those who oppress, like do not commit the same things that you don't want people to do to you.
Yeah.
And then God says, well, then go and do it, right? And what I've read is that folks say, what that is, what these writings are people interpreting God in their own understanding, right? And so, these are people um living in a very harsh world, and through their own interpretations, they're saying, this is who God is. And I think
Mhm.
that we still see that today. People are still, I mean, we're constantly interpreting God, you know and so that's kind of like my understanding of it. I just think it's God's image in people's images, right? It's like God being manifested in people's ideas of who God is. And that's what we're reading. I mean, people wrote this book,
Yes.
people wrote the Bible. Um, And so, yeah, I think that that's what that is. I mean, I still think the Bible is inspired. I still think, and I say that because I mean, it's still a holy book in the sense that it's a book that's used to worship, and it's a book that's used to describe so much and tell so much. And and I love the Bible. I think it's just so interesting, and I think it does speak to the depths of humanity. And I think that that's what I appreciate about the Bible, that it's a book about the darkest and just the most complicated aspects of humanity, and I think that because it's been used so much, by people to oppress, but also to liberate, it's been a book that is just has lived on for millennia. I mean, I think it's fascinating, and I love it. But yeah, I mean, it's been interpreted by people. I mean, even not only just the authors, but then you had the scribes who they would add in their own, like ideas. They would be interpreting it, and then they'd be like, nah, this sounds wrong. Or like they would literally, like as you said, change it. And then that would become canon, that would become what you would read. And so yeah, it's just I think if we allowed the Bible to be what it is, messy and complex and full of human ideology, and I think that, there's so much more we could receive from it. And I say we as in just the general, church.
Yeah, and because, if we have to follow the same mindset of revenge from the Bible, the tribes of Israel did a lot of killing. So we know about the persecution of the Jewish people throughout history. So that could be the revenge of God, the revenge God is looking for to settle
Right.
things, or is karma. So you never know. I mean, if you
Right.
literally follow the Bible mindset,
Right.
this could have happened.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah. And I think that following, like literally trying to literally follow the Bible has what's caused so much turmoil in our world. I don't think the way that people read it as like, a rule book or like a guide. I'm like, for what? Like, what, what do you mean? That's just no, it's stories. It's, as I mentioned, it's talking about the depth of the human experience. It's people trying to make sense of themselves, trying to make sense of their reality. I mean, imagine if you're like a marginalized, and not imagine, I mean, we have this in a reality today, but I'm just trying to put myself in the mindset of the specific Jewish people. But I mean, you're a marginalized people, in living among empires, and you're being, enslaved, and you're being, all these things. Like, of course you're going to dream up of a revengeful and a vengeful God, of course you want someone to liberate you and to smash your oppressors, like putting yourself in that mindset. I mean, it makes sense that that's the God that you're going to dream about and write about. And I mean, so it's just, yeah, people just trying to make sense of their realities. And I think that when we try and prescribe that to everyone, like it's just, it makes no sense.
Yeah, and what's beautiful about it is the metaphors, the hidden messages which we all have to
Right.
dig for. And like any other, honestly, like any other holy book like Bhagavad Gita, where you try to read that book without having an explanation or a spiritual background, you won't be able to understand it. It's so encrypted. But the moment it
Right.
reveals itself is such a beautiful place to be mentally and spiritually, because
Right.
these type of books will change your life.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
I would like to ask you a kind of a sensitive question right now, because you're born in US, which has high standards of democracy and non-interference with other countries, but at the same time they took over a place in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, and
Yeah.
they supposed to leave and they never left.
Yeah.
Do you see this as a conflict of interest between a country which claims that is democratic, but also invade and never leave?
Yes.
And that invasion didn't better the living of Cubans.
Right.
Never
Right.
happened.
Yeah. Yeah, the politics between America and Cuba are very complicated. Very, very complicated. That, and also just the messages that are told about it. I think not only is what has happened is complicated, but I think how it's been told, right? Like the stories that have been formulated, the histories that people believe. When the Great Exodus it happened in Cuba, and it's happened several times, but I'm thinking of 1959 when Castro took over in the early 60s when a lot of the white Cubans, the European Cubans left. Um, I think once it was the perfect storm and the perfect time in history. I mean, it was the height of the Cold War. I mean, communism was like the enemy, and so it was the perfect narrative to continue to perpetuate a specific enemy. And so the US loved that. The US loved that they were able to do that with Cuba, and they loved being able to use the Cuban people as a pawn, as a political pawn in their game. And so I say that because I think that not only is the history of Cuba and the US complicated, but I think also just how it's been told and why you have so many Cubans in the US who are just, I mean, gung ho for Trump. And, I mean, they're just so, because they're so terrified, of the narratives that they've been given, the propaganda and, all of the things. So, anyways, in Abuelita Faith, I write that empire, obviously the US empire, but empire puts people in vulnerable positions. So it puts, it creates this turmoil in all of these countries. It creates, all of this hardship. And then it convinces the people that only they can save them from their hardship. And so it creates hardship in Cuba and then says, oh, but look, come, we've opened the doors for you because communism is the enemy, so it's all a facade, and I think that empire is, I mean, that's what empire is built on. It's built on facade. It's built on saying one thing, but it's not really that thing. And I think that that is what the US has done with Cuba, with so many countries, right? But particularly because we're talking about Cuba, the US is, and at the end of the day, I feel like nobody cares about the Cuban people, really. Nobody cares about the actual people living on the island. I think at the end of the day, you know, whatever's happened politically throughout history, I mean, the last people that have been, thought about are the actual living, breathing Cuban people who have suffered so much. And so it is a tension. It is a tension within my family. It is a tension as I've done my research on Cuban politics, which is so complicated. Yeah, it's certainly been a tension.
Kat, let's talk about your second book. You are working on it. What is it about?
Yeah, so my second book is a Christian devotional, and it's for people who do not read devotionals. So I wanted to, my publisher and I really wanted to get into this space. Devotionals have been very, particularly written by women, have been very much in your traditional evangelical mindset, with your traditional sort of evangelical beliefs. And so yeah, I wanted to write a devotional that was different, a devotional that touched on these topics like empire. I wanted to write a devotional that had people reflecting, on there's 5 sections. So I had people reflecting on things like the body is one section, the feminine, um, uh, and ancestral wisdom. And so I have a section on wisdom, but just, traditional ancestral wisdom. And so, yeah, I have these sections that are when you think of just traditional evangelical Christianity, that it sort of rejects these sort of things, the body and so rejects that. And so I wanted to wrestle with how these are found in the Bible, and also just in our daily lived experiences. So yeah, it's different, and I'm hoping it'll be interesting for folks. It's not as it's not as academic. It's just more reflective.
And when you mention ancestral wisdom, are you going to focus on, let's say, European and North American, or you are looking at South America and maybe Africa as well?
Yeah, mostly South American. And because, I'm obviously looking mostly to like what relates to me. And so I'm looking at Caribbean, a little bit of South American. And because, the African culture and African spirituality is such a big part of Caribbean, ways of being. Yeah, that too.
Yeah, I've been exposed to some African wisdom through some of my guests, and it's just unbelievable.
Yeah,
And also stories of colonialism and their
right.
suffering, and even dissolvement of their own practices, spiritual
Right.
practices, due to what happened to them, and that's sad. But some of them
Yeah.
were able to survive, and they are just amazingly beautiful.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Amen. For sure.
Kat, does your faith and profession stop you from experience an increased level of consciousness through plant medicine?
I've never dabbled into that, mostly not necessarily because of my spirituality, but I don't know, I've never been in a space where I feel safe enough and knowledgeable enough to do that really. I feel like I would really need to find yeah, a place that's safe and for that. I also just became a mother a year ago, so the last few years have just been pregnancy and motherhood, and yeah, it just hasn't been a good time.
Congratulations. I
Oh, thank
hope you are
you.
enjoying it.
Yes, it's wonderful. Exhausting, but wonderful and beautiful.
Yes. I had guests who talk on this podcast about their connection with Black Madonna and how they
Uh-huh.
found saved
Yeah.
spiritually by connecting with Black Madonna. Have you had any encounters with her?
Yeah, well, I've done some research, but I have personally have not encountered any Black Madonnas, and that's actually something I was recently reading a book. I don't know, maybe one of your guests, Christina Cleveland, and she
Yes.
writes a lot about that. Yeah. And so that's been, something that I've also just, excuse me, been so interested in. My experiences, not with Black Madonna, but just with Mary in general, growing up, um, you know, I- Mary was such a big part, and these apparitions of Mary was such a big part of my childhood. Excuse me. I actually preached a sermon yesterday and I talked about this and how, you know, um, Mary would appear, apparitions of Mary would appear anywhere, whether it was like on the side of a house, there would be, in the Spanish news station that my grandmother would watch, every night there would be like a new segment of the news of like a way that Mary had appeared to people, whether it was like a stain on the side of the house or whether it was Mary's image burned on a piece of toast or frozen on TV. Like it was just this, and as I was sharing yesterday, every time I would watch this, I would, be like scared and also amazed. Like, is Mary gonna appear to me one day? Like, am I gonna have one of these experiences with Mary? And I don't think I ever really did. And maybe I just didn't, look hard enough or expect enough. But yeah, anyway, all that to say that that this idea of connecting with or appearing to the divine in this sense has always been something that has been part of my childhood and just my understanding of God. And so it would be wonderful, to have some experiences with the Black Madonna. And yeah, so, but I haven't yet actually.
Yeah, maybe we'll start if you visit some of the
Yeah,
sites
exactly.
who has her. So yeah.
Yeah,
And because you are so involved and you are still involved with studying the Bible, I'd like to know what's your take on Mary Magdalene? How do you see her? Not how the Bible sees her. How do you
right.
see her?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't know if are you familiar with Diana Butler Bass?
Yes.
She preached this incredible message on um, Mary Magdalene, and there was in a specific. So someone has been doing some research on Mary Magdalene. Her name is Libby. I don't remember her last name, but she talks about how she went to the original manuscripts and found original manuscripts of the New Testament. I can't remember exactly which gospel it was in and which original one, but basically, to make a long story short, there's been a mistranslation in, Mary Magdalene in how she has been, spoken about in scripture. And her point is that um how Peter was like the rock of the church and how, Peter is called the rock. Her name I think it's actually Magdalene is actually translates as tower. And so what she's saying is that Magdalene is not necessarily just her name, it is a title, and that title is like the tower of the church. And so you have Peter the rock and Mary, Magdalene the tower, and how she has just because of her role and her leadership throughout during this time. Of course, as we've talked about, the translators, they did not like that, and they have purposely mistranslated her story, so that she doesn't get the proper
Recognition.
respect or place or exactly recognition she's supposed to. So that has been that for me, I was like, yes, I knew this. I knew this. I didn't know obviously the translation history, but that, right? In your body, in your bones, when as you're reading, like this. And so that's how I felt when I heard that. I was like, I knew this. I know this. This is true. I think this is true information. And so I guess just to answer your question, my view of Mary Magdalene is she is the tower of the church.
Great. So, do you think that the Catholic Church will ever or will come out with the right version of the Bible in our lifetime? Because that exists for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I do know that through this dissertation writing, this person that's working on this Mary Magdalene writing, her work has been so monumental that she's actually met with the translating committee in Germany. And so perhaps, right? Perhaps there could be um something that will happen. I mean, power is when you're standing up against power, and by power I mean like the church, which is I mean, that has been probably one of the most powerful entities. You never know. But she has met with the translation committee in Germany, so who knows?
Yeah, so we have to let God work his miracles.
Right. Yes.
Kat, do you have a spiritual daily practice?
Sorry, say that again.
Do you have a spiritual daily practice?
Oh, well, I think the last several years, as I've been working on Abuelita Faith, and I've been trying to become more embodied and trying to connect more, with just my ancestral roots, my ancestral faith. I think for me, one big there's a few little practices that have been very helpful for me. One has been, connecting with like an altar that growing up there was that was huge in my culture, just these altar, these altars that people would set up in their homes. And so that's been something that I've been trying to reclaim, having a specific sacred space that I can go to, and whatever it is that I need to bring to that space, I'm free to do that. I think that's been really helpful for me. And also something that's been really helpful for me is connecting to the lands, connecting to the earth. Again, growing up, a huge part of my grandmother's life and my grandmother's spirituality was connecting to her land and the earth, and physically through her garden and her trees and her but also spiritually, I mean, really connecting with Cuba as an island. I mean, she never let that go. She's in her mid 90s, and she literally will still say, my bones will be buried in a land not my own. And she's talking about the US, and it's just for me incredible to think that you can be somewhere, you can live somewhere for over 50 years at this point, and it's not your land, it's not your home, it's not your place, it's not where your bones belong. And so for me, it's been connecting, whatever way it might look like for me, to my physical land, also connecting to the Cuba that lives within me. And that is through so much of this, whether it's research or whether it's just reading, learning, meditating on these ideas. But one just simple spiritual practice for me is, there's an oak tree that sits behind my home, and I say good morning to my oak tree every morning. And I've gotten to know this oak tree. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and this is the first time that I'm experiencing the seasons growing up in Miami, you don't have the seasons. And so this is the first time I'm experiencing the seasons. And I feel like I've developed this relationship with this oak tree, and I've seen her go through all of her life stages in the last almost 2 years, like lose her leaves, and not all of them because she still has some of them, but, just completely shift and transform. And for me, paying attention to her and listening, to all of the plant and animal life around me. I think that has been something that has really brought me to life in the last few years.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, you brought up so many good points. I mean, I'm far away from my native country as well. And not only 90 miles as you were before, but thousands of kilometers.
Mm.
But what the way I think has changed. And if I consider that we are all God's creation and we are all brothers and sisters and belonging we all belong to the same place, then no matter where I being buried, it's
Right.
pretty much home.
Yeah.
So I have to think from that perspective because I never know
Right.
where I'm going to end up.
Right.
So
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
have to carry with me a burden or a dissatisfaction that I have to be buried back in the land where I was born. Yes, we have
Hmm.
an affinity with that land, that's for sure, and we were born there for a reason. But
Hmm.
also we were brought here to the new land for a reason too. So we have
Right.
to adapt. And last night I watched Avatar 2, and the
Oh,
whole
yeah.
movie is about community, about immersing yourself with Mother Nature and
Yeah.
connecting to Mother Nature. That
Yeah.
connection is so powerful,
Right.
and we kind of lost that.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, that's actually one of the reflections of my upcoming book is on creation and on nature. And I think yeah, that's I feel like that is one of the most devastating realities of colonization. It disconnected us not just from place, but it disconnected us from land and animals. And, we, you know, land became now a resource, a natural resource, or, that's where we saw the introduction of private property, like this, like you own a piece of land, and the land doesn't, no one can own the land, right? I love that in some indigenous traditions it talks about how, the land claims you instead of you claiming the land. And I thought of that as you were talking, wherever you go and wherever you move, are you living as if the land can or is claiming you? Are you living in a mutual reciprocal relationship with the land, so that it's just as much yours as you are its, right? Or you are, and that's even something we shouldn't be using the word it, right? So
Yeah.
the land is just as much yours as it's reciprocal. And so yeah, I think that is, as I mentioned, one of the most devastating things about colonization, and one of the most, I think, beautiful ways and healing ways that we can move forward, is to reconnect with the land and treat it as, a being with, because it is, right? Like the land is it lives and it's growing and it's providing for us, even despite how terrible we might treat it, the land still provides for us. So, yeah.
Yes, that's why when I talk about water, I refer to her like her, she,
Yeah, exactly.
not it,
Exactly.
because
Right.
I know about your connection with, with water, and I wrote about water. I
Oh,
just published an anthology about water. It's love letters to
oh,
water.
amazing.
So that's why we have to change our perception on how we treat the environment.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Kat, we're approaching the end of the interview. Any final thoughts, please?
Um, no, I'm just very thankful for this conversation. In many spiritual conversations, people can come in with assumptions. And so it's always, interesting and fun to talk to folks who, don't already have a preconceived assumption of what God is like, or faith is like, or spirituality is like. And I think that that's something that, as we talked about, moving, or I talked about recently, just moving forward and healing with the land, with each other. And I think it's also in these kinds of spaces moving forward, without assumptions, without preconceived notions of what God is like.
Yes. We have to keep an open mind and learn every day.
Right.
Thank you
Yep.
very much for your time.
Amen.
It's been a lovely discussion. And
Yes,
I
thank you
wish
so
you good
much.
luck with this book, the first book, and the second.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it's been a great time. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And to my viewers, thank you for watching. Like it, share it. Get a free copy of my book when you visit my website. And until next time, love and gratitude.